Okay. Now, at some point, I'm going to talk about my mother's family. It had 18 children in it. But let's start this one. That's around a very important family member in our family, in my family. Shikker. I was born in June 16th, 1961. Shortly after I was 1 year old, about 3 months after I was one, my parents had seen it in front of the local supermarket that was across from Taft High School back then in 1962 in Woodland Hills, California, Los Angeles. Collies being sold as puppies, $20 a piece. And they took the puppy home. As I would grow up, I would always feel bad thinking about that when they told me how they got him and that he was taken from his brothers and sisters and mom. That kind of thing settled in with me. But they raised me and him in the same crib. And there were stories about, I remember my grandmother saying there was, poop in there, and they didn't know which one it was from that she was cleaning up after. They get mad at the dog for biting me, then they get mad at me for biting the dog. And for years, I had known that I had imprinted on Shikker, which is Yiddish for drunk. They named him that. The non-Jewish, non-Yiddish speaking people in the neighborhood always thought his name was Sugar. It's Shikker. It's Yiddish for drunk. I had grown up from 2 to 3 to 4 years old barking. I didn't really talk very much, and when I did talk, my mom was the only one who could understand me because I left the first sound off of every word. But I would bark. And as I even learned how to speak English around 4 years old to 5 years old, I still barked a lot. There was a delicatessen we used to go to, which really kind of set a lot of what I do with bagels and stuff like that in my life. Izzy worked behind the counter, and he would cut the locks, and over the counter he would have me bark like a dog, and he would drop little pieces of locks into my mouth over the counter like a dog. One time in a restaurant counter, we were waiting, sitting there at a counter, and the guy sitting next to us was waiting for the waitress, which was probably his girlfriend, to get off work. And I turned to him and said, that lady keeps looking at you. And he smiled and he said, yeah. And I said, you know how you get people to not look at you? And he said, how? And I go, bark at her. Shikker was definitely imprinting on me as well. They say that collies are very defensive, that they'll pick something to protect. And, collies were used as sheepdogs. They don't look like a sheepdog, but, they worked well for sheep. At that same time, the TV show Lassie was on. And he would sit with me watching Lassie shows, especially whenever he heard that bark, because there's a special bark that collies have. My dad worked in the film industry, and people had found out about his dog, and Shikker, and had asked if they could use him for the Lassie show. My dad refused because he said they do things to the dogs that hurt them, to be able to make them limp and stuff like that. So he stayed with us, but he was also trained to never go in the street, and he became the neighborhood dog. He stayed on our block. He would not go in the street, and we lived about 3 houses from the corner where the stop sign was, and around the corner was our school, my elementary school. And when I had to start school, I would go to kindergarten, and he would hear the bell when I get out of school. Because he couldn't cross the street or go in the street, he would go and sit and wait for me at the stop sign. I used to call him my father. I didn't call him my brother. I called him my father. He seemed bigger than me, and he was extremely protective. There's going to be a few little stories in here, and I'll get to the ending story in just a bit. When I was just a toddler, we had a terraced backyard, retainer walls, and there were some steps that went up at the end of the yard, so I could climb all the way up the yard, up the hill. But I had gotten over to where one of the retainer walls were, and for some reason was lowering myself off it, which is like a 2-meter drop onto cement. And the next door neighbors could see through the fence what was happening, and they were going, "Oh my God, the baby's going to fall and crack his head open." And before they were able to react, because they also knew, to be able to get around. I mean, it wasn't just a fence; it was like a wall with kind of lattice work in it. That's wood that they could see through, and it wasn't just like they could just jump it. They were older people anyway. They came and told my mom. They said if we hadn't seen it with our own eyes, we wouldn't have believed it. He was stuck and hanging off the wall and crying, and Shikker came up underneath me, stood up on the wall as high as he could, nosing at my butt, pushing me up higher, and then ran around the yard, got back up on the hill to where I was on the other, and grabbed me by the shirt, and pulled me up. There was also kind of like a right and wrong stuck in him besides being very protective. As I said, he used to be the neighborhood dog. And there was a dog down at the corner he used to play with named Pierre. It was a standard poodle. And one time he took off after that dog. Pierre took off after this girl on a bicycle riding on the sidewalk, growling and biting at her foot. Shikker had always been friendly with this dog, but he took off after Pierre, and Pierre had to have stitches. He ripped open his stomach. From that moment on, Pierre was kept behind a fence, and when I would take him down to the park that bordered that fence, the two would just go crazy at each other, and there was no stopping my dog. If he saw Pierre, he'd be blooding his nose against trying to get through the chain link fence at him. Yeah, there was couple scenes that were like that. And then one day, I was probably in kindergarten, and we had a carport, and I came out, and there was a man. I didn't know he's a dog catcher, but he's got a lasso, and he's cornering Shikker in the corner, and he wouldn't protect himself very well like he would others. He was just kind of squirreling and cowering down in this corner of our carport. I walked out and saw him running back in the house, screaming, they're taking Shikker away. There's a man taking Shikker away. And my mom came out, got some kind of fine, said that he needs to be on a leash. He cannot be there. We had 50 signatures. My mom went and got and presented to the city, and he was okay. All the neighborhood knew that not only was he not a threat to anyone, that he was actually protecting the kids. And he was allowed to be outside. Well, he was extremely protective of me. My father had trained him, and we had a cat when I was about 4 or 5 years old, 3, 4, 5, around that age. And the cat would just lie on his back waiting for the dog to maul him. It was just a game that they played. And but then my parents found out that, of all things, our cat's name was Toshiro, named after Toshiro Mifune from the Kurosawa films. Yeah, I grew up learning to reading subtitles, seeing in the movie theaters Kurosawa films. But anyway, they found out I'm allergic to cats, and they got rid of the cat. And then I substituted the cat with my dad. My dad would have friends come over, people from the industry, from the film industry, and my dad would want to show off the family and the dog, and he's just like, okay, he wants to show that, he's trained his dog really well. He goes, okay, sit, lie down, sit, shake, those normal things. And then he'd tell me, Tack, lie on the ground. I'd lie on the ground, and he'd say, beat up the cat. And the dog would maul me. I guess cat and tack kind of sound a lot alike. So anyway, my dad, had trained him, but I just was his property. I was my dog's property, and and him mine. We were just family. I never had to train him. Over time, it became my job to feed him, things like that. And as he got older, I cared for him when he would sleep next to me. I put a quilt right next on the floor next to my bed. Well, there's something else. When I was around 5 years old, my dad started to discipline me. More than just getting a spanking. I would get the belt. My dad had never been spanked as a kid, but my mom had told him about, what my grandfather did with the boys in the family. The boys should get the belt, right? And so he didn't know. But my father has his own problems with his dad, and, they didn't get along. So anyway, there were problems with me and my dad from day one. That's another story. But, so my dad took off his belt, And everything's normal because I didn't know what was coming, and my dog didn't know what was coming. Shikker didn't know. So I'm in the room with my dad, and he takes off his belt. And unlike how people would use a belt, my dad held on to the end of the leather belt that didn't have the buckle, and he used it like a whip with the steel buckle end on me. I was 5. Of course, these days, probably just about in any culture, I would have been removed from my family if anyone had ever seen how badly I was welted. And I one time mentioned this to my older sister a few years back, and she said, "He only did that to you once." And what I wanted to say was, like, you only need to do it once. You only need it, whether it's a dog or anybody else. All you have to do is whip somebody like that, and they will be reliving that fear and everything every next time. So my mom saw me afterwards and, was like, "Oh my God, you don't do that to an animal. You don't whip an animal like that. You whip this boy." So the next time my dad told me, "You're getting the belt," you can imagine what my reaction is going to be. I'm a 5-year-old. I'm going to scream. I'm going to grab onto anything I can. And my dad's dragging me. And I'm grabbing onto the wall. I'm grabbing on the couch. I'm grabbing onto anything, right? Shikker reacted. Now, he doesn't want to hurt my dad because my dad's the hand that trains him. But his mouth went from my dad's hand that was holding me. Not to bite hard, but to grab on and tell him to back off, growling. And he yelled for my older sister and my mom. Come get him. And this is the way it would be every time I received a beating. He would first yell for my mom and my older sister to restrain Shikker. And of course, I'm being dragged off. You get to the door, you close the door, and I get my beating. Now, I would never stand still, of course. I'm moving everywhere in the room. I've been stripped down, but he's whipping me. He keeps trying to cut me off from the door, because the moment I start screaming behind the door, my sister and my mom could not hold him back. My parents' bedroom door was so scratched. Every time I got hit, I'm just trying to get to that door. I'm trying to open that door and let him in. Oh, God. I know. So, that happened, right? Well, there were all these great stories with Shikker, but, he was, I guess, it's kind of strange. I say that, like, I used to say for many years that he was my father. I've thought of that as I became a father and got older, and I think, that protectiveness that he had See, we lived in the hills. We lived in, Woodland Hills. We lived right at the base of the hills, and it was all undeveloped, basically, back then. Behind us was sagebrush hills of what were, later all built up. And I grew up in those hills with my dog. My mom said she couldn't get up early enough when I was just a toddler. And she said I'd wake up and the front door was open and there'd be a trail of your clothes and your night clothes leading down the driveway, and you and Shikker were gone. My mom said, but I never worried because I knew he would take care of you. Sounds very negligent mom now, but that was true. My mom thought that, and actually a lot of it was very true. I know it happened more than once, but I have one specific memory in my head, because there were people that had got dogs, and then they don't take care of them. The dogs run off, or the people stop taking care of them, and so there were packs of dogs that kind of roamed around, and we would run into them. And, I thought I was a dog myself back then, so I would go into growling and biting and all that stuff too, but he could take on several dogs. He became like some kind of super, animal if it meant defending me. That's what I mean, and you go back and start thinking about what you would do for your child, and, one day, Shikker, he was 12 years old. I've been taking care of him, but he didn't move very much, and I was concerned. He had been lying down in one spot in the kitchen for, I gone to school, come back, he's still there, and he wasn't getting up to come to the bed, and I couldn't get him to eat. And I told my older sister, who didn't tell my parents, and then finally I told my parents. My dad got mad at my older sister that she'd been told 3 days before and hadn't said anything. And they took him to the vet, and the vet said they were going to hold him for, 2 days. And him just not being there was hard. But on that second day where I know he's coming home, for the last few years of his life, and actually all throughout, my childhood, I would walk with him down to Ventura Boulevard, and for me, he's just another person. I would go into a store and I'd bring Shikker, bring my dog, and they would say, hey, you can't bring your dog in here. And so I'd take him back out, and if I had needed that storage, I'd just tell him to wait. He'd wait there. But some stores, health food store, the warehouse records, they'd let him in, and not only that, they would give him water if it was a hot summer day, which gets very hot there in Los Angeles in the valley. So I got done with junior high school. I was in the 7th grade. It was the first month of junior high school for me. And I told all my friends, Shikker's coming home today. I stopped at the warehouse records to tell them, Shikker's coming home today. And all of a sudden, my older sister shows up. And she says, Dad's home. He needs to talk to you. She drove me, and she didn't say anything. Shikker had died. My dad is the type of person that when something happens like that, he's got to blame somebody. So he blamed her. So she wasn't saying anything. And I get home, I sit on the fireplace, and he's sitting there. And my little sister was like, really small, like 4 or 5, maybe 5, something like that. She's sitting there, and my dad tells me that Shikker died the night before, on Yom Kippur, Jewish holiday. And I crying, of course. My little sister starts faking crying. I looked at her with such I hated her. I just wanted to get away. I went up on the hillside. On the top of our hill, our backyard, we had a place that I always called Shikker's Castle, because he would sit up there where he could watch the whole neighborhood from the highest part of our backyard. And I went up there and sat. And it's the only time my dad ever came into the backyard up on the hill. He never did that, but he came up there and he sat down next to me and he said, I know you thought Shikker was your dog and I thought Shikker was my dog. And basically that's all I really sunk in from whatever he had to say. He could lecture and go on, but I don't think he said a whole lot more. Now, I have a story about those days. I started having reoccurring dreams. I'd cry myself to sleep. I would look at photos of him. I felt like I owed it to him. I felt like I can't go to sleep until I've at least shed a tear for him. All I had of him, I wished he had died at home. I wished he hadn't died alone in some cage. He should have been at home. We didn't get his body. We didn't get to do anything. I got his, they bring back his collar, his chain, his little license. And I've got pictures of him, paintings that I did of him and things. And I go to sleep. Same dream every night. I'm in my front yard. And there he is. He's just appeared. And I go, oh my God, you're not dead. And he'd say, you're dreaming. And I go, oh my God, you can talk too. And he'd go, you're dreaming. and how is this possible? And he goes like, whenever you need me, I'll always be here for you. But here's the thing. Only people that knew me can see me or hear me. And I said, oh, that's great. So the dream goes on and we go down to the warehouse records, go to the health food store. Everyone's happy to see him and they can talk to him. Then we decide to go around to all the stores that always kicked us out because they can't see or hear him. I'd have the same dream every night for weeks. Well, my dad and I ended up having, a tough time with each other. We always had. But it got worse with my parents. It's getting windy. I don't know how much the mic is getting affected. I turned my back so now maybe you can hear, but I'll walk backwards. All right, so yeah, it's really getting windy. So my dad and I, we didn't get along very well. My parents got separated and in the end, my dad got custody of my little sister, and he didn't try for getting me at all because I was already 16. there were incidences leading up to that breakup that made it very bad for him and me. Perhaps another video on that. But so I'm trying to walk this way, but we're going to get some wind. I don't know how that's going to sound. All right, so going back, my father and I fall out, and I always felt, actually, because at the time that Shikker died, we had a rabbit in the backyard that he got along with really well. The rabbit used to clean his toenails while he slept, and he and we would chase the rabbit for fun, and he would jump and land on top of the rabbit. You know, it was just a game. We were all playing for the rabbit. I'm sure it wasn't that much fun, but we would just catch and release. You know, like when I was around 11, 12 years old, right towards the end of his life. And then we had some mallard ducks, that both male. They used to pick on the rabbit, but Shikker would chase them away. He'd make sure that the rabbit was okay. Well, Shikker died. Rabbit, we'd like to think, ran away. I think he probably got eaten, maybe taken by a hawk or something. He probably lost his protection. I mean, you know, we got rid of the ducks. And I always felt like everything got worse with our family, with that one element of our family being gone. And I think that kind of thing is true in life. You could take one element and you'll get this domino effect if you remove it. So I went on my way, stayed in contact with my mom as I was out traveling. Over time, I realized by the age of 21 that I needed to let go of hatred that I was holding toward my father. And I wrote a song and sent it to him, and tried contacting him. He just pointed out how many times I used the words I, me, and my in the song, because when I was a kid I wasn't allowed to use those words. Yeah, for people that are in the psychological game, they're kind of getting a picture of who my dad is. Yeah, it's very hard to tell anybody what's happened in your day without being able to use any words that refer to yourself. Finally, I ended up in my 30s, after many failed attempts to contact my father, where he wouldn't want to talk to me. I think every time it was really hard to ever pick up the phone again and try to call him. One of the times I called him, he actually asked this question, like, why is it so important for you to have a relationship with me? And I said, because you're my father. And he said, that's not a good enough answer. And I was in tears. As a man, I was in tears. My dad could make me feel like I was 5 years old again. And I'm in tears saying, it's the only answer I have. You know, he could be really bad with me. But I saw a therapist for a while, and a therapist had told me that the type of person that my father is that you can never, if you wanted to have any kind of relationship with him, the only way to ever be able to do that is to let him be 100% right, 100% of the time, never contradict him on anything. No matter what, you have to let him be right. She didn't know if I could do that. it meant enough for me in the hole that I had to do that. And I did it for 27 years. And in the end, he's decided to block even my son and my wife and me. But yeah, it's hard to just let that one lie. He was trying to tell me that my wife and I were not being good parents to my son, which I finally broke the rule and told him, I know you mean well, but you can't say that. We're doing everything right. We're doing everything we can. You can't do that, especially write my wife and say that. And I didn't know it at that time, but because I continued to write to him, we just never heard from him. It took me a long time to realize that he had blocked me on all levels from that date. So, but going back to when I could still talk to him, I was in Malaysia, and we were carrying on a conversation through email. I got to take this back a little bit further. Back in my 30s, when I finally was able to talk to him, and we would talk, and we would have good talks. I'd let him talk. He'd tell me all about, what he was doing, and that I'd give him bits and pieces of my life. And I had mentioned something about Shikker. And the next time I talked to him, he had said, I forgot that you and I had Shikker in common. Because he says, I can't talk about Shikker. If I ever mention anything about Shikker, both your sisters will start saying, here we go again, the dog that was prettier and smarter than Lassie, rolling their eyes. And that was nice. And then, to hear that. And there was a moment in there where we were talking about him, and he had said something to me that he and I would always be connected. And I've forgiven my father. I've written about it. I've written him a letter that was dealing with all that. Of course, I didn't hear from him, but that's okay, because I needed to find forgiveness for everything. For myself. Not for him. That's for me. And people kind of misunderstand that. They think that forgiveness is a pardon for things. No, things that were wrong. They shouldn't have happened. You were not deserving of things that happened that were wronged to you. But the only way to let go of stuff is to make it okay. That, yeah, I can still talk about it. I can still say, that was really wrong. And that shouldn't have happened. And you think about this and you have empathy for other people. But there's this thing that happened. I usually didn't have good dreams about my father. Once I forgave my father, once I started working on it, vocalizing it, I had a dream. And it was a dream of my father and I just sitting out someplace in nature. He was a bit younger. I was a bit younger. And I'm telling him about my life or things that I think. And he's listening. And he's hearing me. And he's saying things that are going along with what I'm saying. And it's a good connection. It was very good. And I woke up because it was morning. I woke up from that dream. I was sad because I realized that that's not real. That's my subconscious. And I came to believe and think that what I had projected of my father am myself in the dream. That's my son and me. I became the father that I'm thinking Shikker would have wanted me to be. You know, I had a talk one time with my son, and I knew that things weren't difficult. I picked him up from the station. We were driving him home, and he's usually quiet. It's that time, a teenage thing. And I told him, I said, you know, I'm not going to always get what your decisions are. Because I'm from a different time. So, I mean, I'm not going to get it. There's going to be lots of things that you make decisions in your life, and I'm not going to understand them. But, you know, I don't want you to ever think for a moment that I don't love you. You know, because, you know, you're my favorite guy. That'll never change for me. And my son was quiet for a second, and he said, yeah, Dad, I know that. And I thought afterwards, hearing him say that, I felt like, kind of hit, because I don't think anyone should ever have to worry or wonder that their father doesn't love them. So anyway, my father had said this thing, we'll always be connected. And I was in Malaysia, and I was writing with him email. But we were writing really short emails, like people do text, and he's writing back. I remember I was sitting in a McDonald's, because we have free Wi-Fi, McDonald's there at the place where I was working in Malaysia. And I told my dad about when I was in kindergarten, and I'd be walking home from school, and I'd see Shikker waiting at the stop sign for me, greeting me coming home. I told him, when I die, that's what I hope and suspect I will see. And I still think that. And I still think somewhere, though my dad is handicapped emotionally with me in this life, that when we move on from this life, we're lifted from the problems that hinder us. And I think my dad has a certain condition that's overly used these days, but it kind of fits textbook things with it. And that's part of the forgiveness too, is to realize, even though that hurts, that he's unable to be different in this life. And I think maybe someday that dream I had of my father and I talking might also be something that's real. And that's my life as a dog. Okay. Now, at some point, I'm going to talk about my mother's family.